What if you woke up tomorrow and everyone you ever loved had been dead for centuries? What if the world you knew, your home, your family, your entire reality, simply no longer existed? These aren't hypothetical questions. These are the lived nightmares of real people. Documented cases of individuals who claim they traveled through time and discovered the most horrifying truth imaginable. There is no way back. These are 10 time travel survivors who can never return home. Number 10, the Vanishing Pilot of 1953. This case is one of the most haunting time travel stories ever documented, and once you hear it, you will understand exactly why some journeys have no return ticket. Imagine you're a military test pilot in the early days of the Cold War. You've been selected for a classified mission, something called Operation Skylance, a project so secret that even your own family doesn't know it exists. Your assignment is simple on paper, but terrifying in practice. Fly higher than any human has ever flown before and test whether a new experimental coating can make your aircraft invisible to Soviet radar. It's September 14th, 1953, and you're about to climb into a cockpit that will take you to the edge of space itself. Lieutenant James Whitmore was 28 years old that morning. He had a wife named Catherine waiting for him back in Nevada, a woman who had already learned to live with the long silences and the missions she could never ask about. She kissed him goodbye that Tuesday, never knowing it would be the last time she would ever see her husband as the young man she married. At exactly 11:47 a.m., Whitmore's aircraft reached 85,000 feet, higher than almost any pilot had ever traveled. And then something went terribly wrong. His radio transmissions became garbled, filled with static and strange interference. Ground control reported hearing fragments of words, something about lights and a tunnel, and then nothing. Complete silence. His plane vanished from every radar screen simultaneously, as if it had simply stopped existing. Search teams scoured the Nevada desert for weeks. They found nothing. No wreckage, no parachute, no body. The military declared Lieutenant James Whitmore dead, killed in action during a classified operation. Catherine held a funeral with an empty casket and eventually, after years of waiting, remarried. The world moved on. James Whitmore became a forgotten name in a classified file. But 66 years later, something absolutely impossible happened. In October 2019, an elderly man stumbled into a Veterans Affairs hospital in Reno, Nevada. He was disoriented, confused, and appeared to be in his 90s. But around his neck hung a set of military dog tags, and when nurses read the name stamped into the metal, they froze. James Whitmore, serial number matching the records of a pilot who had been declared dead in 1953. The man insisted he was Lieutenant Whitmore. He described his final mission in perfect detail. Details that had remained classified for decades. He spoke about Catherine, about their small apartment near the base, about the song that was playing on the radio the morning he left. He knew things that only James Whitmore could possibly know. Medical examinations revealed something deeply unsettling. Despite appearing to be in his 90s, his bone density and organ condition didn't match someone of that age. His body seemed younger than it should have been, as if time had moved differently for him than for everyone else. And when investigators compared his fingerprints to military records from 1953, they matched perfectly. When asked what happened to him, Whitmore spoke quietly, his voice trembling. He described ejecting from his aircraft into a tunnel of blinding white light that seemed to stretch on forever. When he finally landed, he thought he was still in the Nevada desert, but everything was wrong. The roads were different. Strange vehicles hummed past him. Buildings he didn't recognize stretched toward the sky. He had no idea where he was or when he was. He only knew that he had to find his way home. He spent 66 years trying, moving from city to city, searching for answers, unable to explain to anyone where he had come from without sounding insane. And when he finally gave up, when his body finally began to fail him, he stumbled into that hospital hoping someone would believe him. The investigators eventually asked if there was anyone he wanted to see. Whitmore asked for Catherine. When they told him she had died in 2003, the old pilot broke down completely. He whispered through his tears, "I was trying to get back before she forgot me." James Whitmore spent 66 years trying to return to a home that no longer existed, to a woman who had already lived an entire life without him. And that is absolutely heartbreaking. But trust me, the cases ahead are even more intense. Number 9. The Japanese fisherman who saw the end. This case is so disturbing that even the researchers who investigated it couldn't fully explain what they witnessed. A man pulled from the ocean, carrying items from the 1840s, speaking a language that hadn't been used in over a century, and describing visions of destruction that sound terrifyingly like nuclear war. Imagine you're a fisherman on a cold morning in 1971, hauling nets off the coast of Hokkaido, Japan. The sun is just beginning to rise over the Pacific, casting golden light across the waves. And then you see something floating in the distance. At first you think it's debris, maybe wreckage from a storm. But as your boat draws closer, you realize it's a man, clinging desperately to a piece of wooden wreckage, barely conscious, dressed in clothes you've only seen in history books. The crew of the Mizuki Maru pulled him aboard approximately 40 kilometers offshore. He was hypothermic, delirious, and dressed in traditional clothing that appeared to be from Japan's Edo period, roughly the mid-1800s. In a small pouch around his neck, they found coins minted during the Tenpo era, currency that hadn't been in circulation for over 100 years. At first, authorities assumed he was mentally ill or performing some kind of elaborate hoax. But when university linguists were brought in to interview him, they made a stunning discovery. The man spoke Japanese, but not modern Japanese. His dialect contained grammatical structures, vocabulary, and pronunciation patterns that hadn't been used since the 1850s. He wasn't pretending to be from the past. He was speaking exactly as someone from that era would speak. The man identified himself as Harada Kisuke, a fisherman from a small coastal village. When researchers checked historical records, they found that his village had indeed existed, but was abandoned in the 1860s following a series of devastating earthquakes. According to every official document, Harada Kisuke and everyone he knew had been dead for more than a century. But here's where the story becomes truly terrifying. When asked what happened to him, Harada described fishing alone one night when a great whirlpool of fire appeared in the sky above him. The ocean began to churn, and before he could react, his boat was pulled into what he called a tunnel of burning light. He lost consciousness, and when he awoke, he was floating in the same ocean, but everything around him had changed. The stars looked different, the water smelled strange, and on the horizon he saw something that made his blood run cold. Cities were burning, massive structures he couldn't comprehend were collapsing into the sea. He described a light brighter than 1,000 suns rising in the west, followed by a wave of fire that consumed everything it touched. He spoke of iron ships that moved without sails and metal birds that fell from the sky trailing smoke and flames. He said he watched the world end before the ocean pulled him under again. When investigators showed him photographs of Hiroshima after the atomic bombing, Harada collapsed to the floor screaming. He pointed at the images with trembling fingers, crying out that it had already happened, that he had seen it with his own eyes, that the fire was coming for everyone. The researchers were faced with an impossible conclusion. Harada Kisuke appeared to have traveled forward in time, not to 1971, but to some point in the future where nuclear devastation had consumed the world. And then, somehow, he had been thrown backward again, landing in an ocean that existed more than a century after his own time, but before the apocalypse he had witnessed. He became convinced that he hadn't simply traveled through time. He believed he had been shown the future as a warning, a message that humanity was destined to destroy itself. But he was trapped in the wrong era, unable to prevent what was coming, unable to return to the world he knew. In 1973, Harada Kisuke walked into the Pacific Ocean and was never seen again. Some believe he drowned himself in despair. Others believe he was still searching for the whirlpool that might carry him home. His body was never recovered. Did this man truly witness humanity's destruction? And if the warning was real, has it already come to pass? Or is the worst still ahead of us? Absolutely chilling. And the next case takes things to an entirely different level. Number 8, the London Underground incident. This case is so deeply unsettling that even decades later, the investigators who first entered that sealed chamber still refuse to discuss what they found. A woman entombed beneath the streets of London for nearly a century, wearing clothes that wouldn't exist for another 15 years, carrying a message for a daughter who hadn't yet been born. Imagine you're a construction worker in 1982, part of a crew expanding the Jubilee line beneath the ancient streets of London. You've been drilling through layers of Victorian-era brickwork when suddenly your equipment breaks through into a hollow space that isn't on any blueprint. The air that rushes out is stale, untouched for what must be decades. You shine your flashlight into the darkness and see something that makes your heart stop. A wooden compartment, sealed from the inside, and through a small crack in the boards, you can make out the shape of a human figure. Transport for London workers made this discovery near Baker Street Station in the spring of 1982. Behind a section of bricked-up tunnel, they found a chamber that appeared to have been constructed in the 1890s, based on the materials and techniques used. Inside that chamber was a sealed wooden compartment, roughly the size of a large wardrobe, airtight and untouched for what forensic experts estimated to be approximately 90 years. When they finally opened it, they found her, a woman, approximately 35 years old, remarkably preserved due to the airtight conditions. She was sitting upright against the back wall, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes closed as if she had simply fallen asleep. But it was her clothing that made the investigators call in specialists who would spend years trying to explain what they were seeing. She was wearing synthetic fabrics, polyester blends with machine-made stitching patterns and modern zippers that hadn't been invented in the 1890s. The labels inside her jacket indicated manufacture dates of 996 and 97, 15 years in the future from when she was discovered. On her wrist was a digital watch, non-functional but unmistakably modern technology. In her pocket was a keycard with a magnetic stripe, the kind used to access secure buildings in the late 20th century. Forensic pathologists estimated she had died approximately 90 years before discovery, placing her death somewhere around 1892. But everything she carried came from a century later. It was as if someone from the 90s had been transported backward in time and left stranded in Victorian London with no way to return. Among her possessions, investigators found something that still haunts everyone who read it: a handwritten journal, over 200 pages long, documenting her desperate attempts to find her way home. The entries began with confusion and denial. She wrote about waking up in a London she didn't recognize, with horse-drawn carriages instead of cars, gas lamps instead of electric lights, and people who looked at her clothing with suspicion and fear. She described approaching police officers who thought she was mad, visiting scientists who had no framework to understand what she was telling them. Every door she tried was closed. Every hope she clung to eventually crumbled. The middle sections of the journal traced years of isolation, of learning to survive in an era where she had no identity, no history, no one who would believe her story. She wrote about watching the 20th century approach, knowing that her own time was getting closer, knowing that she might live long enough to see her own era arrive if she could just hold on. But the final entries revealed a devastating surrender. She described sealing herself inside the compartment, leaving instructions that it should never be opened, hoping that if she couldn't travel forward to her time, perhaps her time would eventually travel forward to her. Her last written words were an address in London and a single desperate plea: "If anyone finds this, please tell my daughter I never stopped trying to get back to her." The address she wrote corresponds to a house that wasn't built until 2001. And somewhere, perhaps, a woman is living her life without knowing that her mother died 90 years before she was born, entombed beneath the streets of London, clutching a message that arrived a century too early. Who was she? How did she get there? And is her daughter still waiting for answers? The next case is even more mysterious. Number 7. The Cosmonaut's Impossible Return. This case was buried so deeply by Soviet authorities that it took decades for even fragments of the story to emerge. A man in a deteriorating spacesuit appearing out of nowhere in a restricted military zone, claiming to be a cosmonaut from a mission that never officially existed, carrying memories of companions still falling through time, somewhere above the Earth. Imagine you're a Soviet border guard in 1987, patrolling the perimeter of the Baikonur Cosmodrome in the remote steppes of Kazakhstan. It's the middle of the night, freezing cold, and the only sounds are the wind sweeping across the endless flat landscape. Then you see movement near the fence, a figure stumbling through the darkness, moving erratically, wearing something bulky and reflective that catches your flashlight beam. As you approach with your weapon raised, you realize you're looking at a spacesuit, a design you've only seen in old photographs from the early days of the Soviet space program. The guards who encountered him that night reported that the man was severely disoriented, suffering from dehydration and exposure, as if he had been wandering for days. His spacesuit was a so-called design consistent with the late 1960s, decades out of date and showing signs of extreme wear. When they finally removed his helmet, they found a man who appeared to be in his 30s, terrified and confused, speaking Russian with an accent that seemed strangely old-fashioned. He identified himself as Yevgeny Volkov, a backup cosmonaut for the Vostok program. He carried documentation with correct Soviet formatting, classified mission protocols, and personal identification papers that looked authentic but referenced a program that had ended over 20 years earlier. When authorities searched their records for any trace of a Yevgeny Volkov, they found nothing. According to every official document, this man had never existed. Medical examination revealed deeply troubling anomalies. His body showed elevated radiation levels consistent with unshielded space exposure, the kind of readings you would expect from someone who had spent time outside a spacecraft without proper protection. But there was no matching mission, no record of any accident, no explanation for how he could have been exposed to cosmic radiation while standing in Kazakhstan. The man insisted, with absolute conviction, that it was October 1961. He seemed genuinely shocked when shown newspapers with the current date. He kept asking about Premier Khrushchev, about missions that were still in development in his memory but had been completed decades ago in reality. His psychological evaluation showed no signs of deception. Whatever he believed had happened to him, he believed it completely. When pressed for details, Volkov described a mission that sounded like something from a nightmare. He spoke of an unauthorized orbital test, a spacewalk that was never supposed to happen, performed in secret to gather data the official program couldn't acknowledge. He described stepping outside the capsule and immediately sensing that something was wrong. Time outside the spacecraft, he said, moved differently than time inside. The stars shifted too quickly. The Earth below him seemed to blur and change. When he climbed back into the capsule, everything had changed. His crewmates were gone. The radio produced only static, and when he looked down at the planet below, the continent seemed wrong somehow. The lights on the night side forming patterns he didn't recognize. He managed to land the capsule, but he landed in a world that had moved on without him, a world where decades had passed in what felt like hours. But the most chilling part of his testimony came when investigators asked if he had been alone on the mission. Volkov's face went pale. He explained that there had been others, 2 fellow cosmonauts who had been outside the capsule with him when time began to fracture. He watched them drift away, falling not through space, but through time itself, pulled in directions he couldn't follow. He said he could still hear them sometimes, their voices crackling through frequencies that shouldn't exist, calling for help from somewhere between the seconds. "They are still up there," he whispered. "They have been falling since 1961, and no one is coming to save them." Volkov was placed in a psychiatric facility near Moscow, where he reportedly spent years drawing orbital trajectories, trying to calculate where his crewmates might eventually land and when. Did this cosmonaut truly fall through time? And are his companions still out there, trapped between moments? The next case goes even deeper. Number 6, the Polaroid from 2045. This case might sound like something from a science fiction film, but the evidence that emerged from it and has baffled investigators, scientists, and skeptics alike. A woman carrying a photograph of a future that hasn't happened yet, stranded in a time she doesn't belong to, holding proof of a catastrophe she has no way to prevent. Imagine you're a police officer in Melbourne, Australia in 2008. It's a quiet afternoon at the station when a woman walks through the front door looking completely lost. She's dressed normally enough, but something about her seems off. Her eyes dart around the room as if she's never seen a police station before. When you ask for her identification, she hands you a single Polaroid photograph and says 5 words that make absolutely no sense. "I need to warn everyone." The woman identified herself as Mira Okonkwo, age 32, Australian citizen. But when officers ran her name through every database available, they found nothing. No birth certificate, no immigration records, no driver's license, no tax file number. According to every official system in Australia, Mira Okonkwo did not exist and had never existed. But it was the photograph she carried that truly stunned everyone who examined it. The Polaroid showed Mira standing in front of what was unmistakably the Sydney Opera House. Except it wasn't the Opera House as anyone in 2008 knew it. In the photograph, the iconic white shells were partially collapsed, covered in creeping vegetation. The harbor behind her was noticeably higher, water lapping at structures that should have been well above sea level. The sky had a strange brownish tint, and in the distance you could see the skeletal remains of buildings that had clearly been abandoned for years. chemical analysis of the photograph revealed something that scientists couldn't explain. The compounds used in its development didn't match any known Polaroid film. The molecular patterns were inconsistent with any manufacturing process that existed in 2008. When specialists finally dated the chemical composition, they arrived at an impossible conclusion. The photograph appeared to have been developed in approximately 2045. When questioned, Mira spoke calmly, but with an undercurrent of deep distress. She explained that she was from the year 2045, a time when Australia had been devastated by climate catastrophe. She described rising sea levels that had swallowed entire coastal cities, mass migrations that had reshaped the continent, and a civilization struggling to survive in a world that was rapidly becoming uninhabitable. She said she had been a recorder, someone whose job was to document historical sites before they disappeared beneath the rising waters forever. She had been photographing the Opera House on what she described as a routine assignment when everything changed. There was a flash of blinding white light, a sensation of falling that seemed to last forever, and then she woke up in a park in Melbourne with no idea how she had arrived. The photograph in her hand was the only proof that her world had ever existed. The most heartbreaking aspect of Mira's account was her explanation for why she could never return. The technology that sent her backward in time, she said, hadn't been invented yet in 2008. It wouldn't be developed until the 2030s, as a desperate attempt to send warnings to the past. But now that she was here, stranded decades before that technology existed, there was no mechanism that could bring her home. When investigators pointed out that she could simply wait until the time machine was invented and asked to be sent back, Mira shook her head with tears in her eyes. She explained that by traveling to the past, she had already changed the timeline. The future she came from might no longer exist. The machine that sent her might never be built. And even if it was, the world it existed in would be fundamentally different from the one she remembered. Because the machine that sent me hasn't been built yet, she whispered, and after what happened, it probably never will be. Mira Okonkwo reportedly lives somewhere in Australia today, carrying a Polaroid photograph of a future that may still arrive, a future she was sent to prevent but has no power to change. She is the only witness to a catastrophe that hasn't happened yet. Is her warning a prophecy or a memory? The next case will truly shock you. Number 5. The Children of the Amber Room. This case combines one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries with something even more inexplicable. Two children emerging from a forest 6 decades after they vanished, carrying a fragment of a legendary treasure that disappeared during World War II, claiming they had been trapped inside a room made of golden light where time itself had stopped. Imagine you're a hiker in the forests near Kaliningrad, Russia in 2003. This region was once called Königsberg, part of Germany before the borders of Europe were redrawn after the Second World War. The forest is dense, ancient, and filled with shadows even in the middle of the day. And then you hear something that makes you stop in your tracks. Children's voices, speaking German, calling out for help somewhere deeper in the trees. The hikers who discovered them reported finding 2 children huddled together in a small clearing, a boy approximately 10 years old and a girl around 8. They were dressed in clothing that looked like it belonged in a museum. Wool coats and leather shoes consistent with 1940s wartime Germany. They were terrified, shivering, and speaking a dialect of German that the hikers could barely understand. When authorities arrived and brought in translators, linguists identified the children's speech patterns as mid-20th century German, filled with vocabulary and expressions that hadn't been commonly used in over 60 years. The children identified themselves as Hans and Else Brenner, and they insisted with absolute conviction that the year was 1904. Historical records confirmed that a Hans and Else Brenner had indeed existed. They were siblings from Königsberg who had been evacuated during the Soviet advance in late 1944. Their transport train never arrived at its destination. They were presumed dead, 2 more casualties among the millions lost during the war. Yet here they stood, 6 decades later, having aged not a single day. When asked what happened to them, the children told a story that defied all rational explanation. They described hiding during a bombing raid in the famous Amber Room, the legendary chamber made of 6 tons of amber panels, gold leaf, and precious stones that had been looted by Nazi forces and installed in Königsberg Castle. The room was considered one of the greatest art treasures ever created, and it vanished completely during the war. No one has ever discovered what happened to it. The children said they were inside the room when the bombs began to fall. They described the walls beginning to glow with an intense golden light as explosions shook the castle. The amber panels started to vibrate, and the air itself seemed to thicken around them. Then everything went white, and they felt themselves being pulled somewhere else, somewhere that wasn't quite a place at all. They described existing in what they called the golden light for what felt like only a few hours. There was no sound, no hunger, no cold, just endless amber radiance surrounding them in every direction. And then, just as suddenly as it began, they found themselves standing in the forest, the light fading behind them like a closing door. For them, almost no time had passed. For the world, 60 years had vanished. But the most compelling evidence came from what they carried with them. Clutched in the boy's hand was a palm-sized fragment of carved amber, its design matching exactly the documented motifs of the amber room panels. Electromagnetic analysis of the fragment revealed unusual internal structures that shouldn't form naturally in fossilized resin, as if the amber itself had been altered at a molecular level. When investigators asked about their parents, both children began to cry. They said their mother and father had been in the room with them when the light came, but when the children were pulled out, their parents stayed behind. "They are still in the light," the girl whispered. "They couldn't follow us. They are still inside the room." Perhaps most disturbing of all, medical examinations over the following years revealed that Hans and Else were not aging normally. By 2010, 7 years after their discovery, doctors estimated they had physically matured by only 2 years. Whatever golden light had held them for 6 decades seemed to still have a grip on their bodies, as if they had never fully escaped. Where is the amber room now? And are their parents still trapped inside it? The next case goes even deeper into the impossible. Number 4, the recording that hasn't been made yet. This case is so strange that even the experts who analyzed the evidence couldn't agree on what they were hearing. A radio transmission from a woman describing a catastrophe in real time, broadcasting on equipment that won't be manufactured for decades, warning a world that might still have time to listen. Imagine you're an amateur radio enthusiast in New Mexico in '94. It's nearly 4 in the morning, and you're scanning through frequencies the way you do most nights, listening to the static and occasional chatter that fills the airwaves. Then you hear something that makes your blood run cold. A woman's voice, trembling with fear, breaking through on a frequency that shouldn't exist, describing something terrible happening right now, begging for someone, anyone, to respond. Marcus Chen was the radio operator who first captured the transmission on that October night. He recorded everything, a habit he had developed over years of monitoring unusual signals. What he captured would eventually be analyzed by audio engineers, military specialists, and physicists, none of whom could fully explain what they were hearing. The woman's voice was frantic but professional, the tone of someone trained to remain calm during emergencies, but pushed beyond her limits. She identified herself as Dr. Sarah Vance, FEMA Region 9, and declared that she was initiating an emergency broadcast. She kept repeating coordinates that corresponded to a location in the Nevada desert, asking if anyone was receiving her signal, growing more desperate with each repetition. She described a flash in the west, a light that had appeared without warning on the horizon. Then she spoke of smoke that wouldn't stop rising, spreading across the sky like a curtain being drawn over the sun. Her voice cracked as she said that everything east of the mountains was gone, that there was no response from any station, that she didn't know how much time they had left. The transmission ended abruptly with words that still haunt everyone who has heard them. "This is our final broadcast. If anyone is receiving this in the past, do not let this happen. Repeat, do not let this." And then nothing. Static. Silence. Chen reported the transmission to authorities, who were skeptical until they investigated the coordinates the woman had provided. What they found in that remote section of Nevada desert raised more questions than answers. There was an abandoned facility there, partially buried and showing signs of extreme age despite appearing on no official records. Inside, investigators discovered equipment that defied explanation. The technology was decades ahead of anything available in '94, using alloy compositions and manufacturing techniques that metallurgical analysis dated to the 2030s. The machinery appeared to have been designed specifically for one purpose: to broadcast radio signals not across distances but across time itself. Among the debris, they found a partial roster, a list of personnel assigned to something called the Temporal Emergency Communication Initiative. One name stood out immediately: Dr. Sarah Vance, listed as Emergency Communications Director, with a recruitment date of 29. But here is where the case becomes truly unsettling. Audio specialists subjected the recording to extensive vocal pattern analysis, comparing the woman's voice against databases of known speakers. They found a match with 97.3% confidence. The voice belonged to a girl who, in '94, was only 14 years old, a high school student living in Albuquerque, New Mexico, a girl named Sarah Vance. The implications were staggering. The woman in the recording appeared to be the adult version of a teenager who hadn't yet graduated high school. She was broadcasting from a future where she had become a government emergency official, using technology that wouldn't be invented for another 4 decades, trying desperately to send a warning back through time to prevent whatever catastrophe was consuming her world. Sarah Vance is now in her early 40s, a communications specialist working in the southwestern United States. She has never heard the recording of her own voice from a future that may or may not still exist. And if the warning worked, if someone in the past managed to change what was coming, then perhaps she never will. Did her message save us from a disaster we'll never know about? Or is the catastrophe she described still waiting somewhere ahead? The next case is absolutely mind-bending. Number 3, the ship that returned empty. This case is one of the most terrifying maritime mysteries ever recorded. A vessel lost for over half a century, suddenly reappearing with dinner still warm on the table, engines still running, and a single survivor whose body had aged 55 years while his ship remained frozen in a single November afternoon. Imagine you're a Coast Guard officer in 2017, responding to a routine report of a drifting vessel in the Caribbean. The coordinates place it roughly 200 miles southeast of Miami, well within the infamous boundaries of the Bermuda Triangle. As your cutter approaches, you see the ship through your binoculars and something immediately feels wrong. The vessel looks old, impossibly old, like something from another era, but its lights are on, its engines are humming, and there's no visible damage. It's not a wreck. It's a ghost that refuses to stop running. The ship was identified as the Maria Elena, a fishing vessel that had been reported missing in November 1962. 55 years earlier, it had departed from a small port in Florida with a crew of 6 men and simply vanished. No distress call, no wreckage, no biggies. The Bermuda Triangle had claimed another victim, and the world had long since stopped looking. But now, here it was, floating in calm waters as if it had never been gone at all. When the boarding team climbed aboard, they found something that defied every rational explanation. The ship was in pristine condition. There was no marine growth on the hull, no corrosion on the metal fittings, no weathering that would suggest decades at sea. The fuel tanks were nearly full. The engine was running smoothly. And in the galley, they found plates of food still warm on the table, as if the crew had just stepped away for a moment and would return any second. The calendar on the wall showed November 1962. The clock on the bridge was still ticking, showing the correct time for that long-ago afternoon. Everywhere they looked, the boarding team found evidence of a ship that had somehow remained frozen in a single moment while the rest of the world aged around it. Then they heard something from below deck, a faint sound, barely audible over the hum of the engines. Someone coughing. In a small berth at the bottom of the ship, they found him. An elderly man, barely alive, curled in a corner with a leather journal clutched against his chest. He was severely malnourished, his eyes clouded with cataracts, his body appearing to be in its late 80s or early 90s. He could barely speak, but when they asked his name, he whispered it clearly enough. Ricardo Velasquez, first mate of the Maria Elena, 24 years old. Medical records from 1962 confirmed the identification. Dental records matched. A previously broken arm aligned perfectly with the old X-rays. Even the birthmarks were identical. This was Ricardo Velasquez, but somehow his body had experienced over 50 years of aging, while his ship had experienced none. His journal told a story that no one could fully comprehend. Ricardo described the crew entering a fog that wasn't really fog, a thick grayish barrier that seemed to swallow all sound and light. When they emerged on the other side, they found themselves in an ocean they didn't recognize. The stars were wrong. The radio produced only static. No matter which direction they sailed, they never found land. The entries spanned years. One by one, the crew members disappeared. Some walked into the water without explanation, others simply vanished from their bunks during the night. Ricardo wrote of hearing voices calling from beneath the waves, familiar voices belonging to crewmates who had already gone. He described an ocean that was alive somehow, aware of them, patient in ways that human minds couldn't comprehend. The final entry was written just hours before the Coast Guard arrived. "I think the sea finally let me go, but it kept the others. I can still hear them calling from somewhere under the water." Ricardo Velasquez died in the hospital 3 days after his rescue. His last words were a warning. "Don't send anyone to look for them. They're not lost. They're exactly where they're supposed to be. It's us who are in the wrong time." What took the crew of the Maria Elena, and are they still out there, somewhere beneath the waves? The next case is even more disturbing. Number 2, the woman who lived twice. This case is unlike anything else on this list, because it doesn't involve machines or portals or mysterious lights. It involves something far more terrifying, a consciousness trapped in time, forced to relive an entire existence while watching helplessly as everyone she ever loved grows old and dies without knowing she's still there. Imagine you're 48 years old, living a normal life in Ohio, when you start experiencing memories that don't belong to you. Except they do belong to you. They're vivid, detailed, and absolutely real. You remember a childhood in a house you've never visited, a wedding to a man you've never met, children whose faces you know as intimately as your own reflection. And slowly, horrifyingly, you begin to realize that these aren't false memories at all. They're your memories, from a life you already lived, nearly a century ago. Eleanor Marsh first sought medical help in 2015, when the memories became too overwhelming to ignore. Doctors initially diagnosed her with confabulation, a neurological condition that causes the brain to generate detailed false memories. But something about Eleanor's case didn't fit the pattern. Her memories weren't vague or dreamlike. They contained specific addresses, full names, dates, and historical details that could be independently verified. She described growing up in Cleveland in the 1920s, the daughter of a factory worker and a seamstress. She remembered the smell of her mother's kitchen, the sound of the radio playing in the parlor, the way the light fell through the windows of her childhood bedroom. She spoke about meeting a man named Walter at a church social in 1932, falling in love, getting married in a small ceremony during the depths of the Depression. When historians investigated her claims, they found something that defied explanation. Eleanor Marsh had existed. A woman by that exact name had lived in Cleveland, had married a man named Walter Marsh in 1932, had raised 2 children in a modest home on the east side of the city. She had died in 1952 at the age of 67 from a sudden stroke. The living Eleanor couldn't explain the connection. She simply remembered that life as her own. She could describe the wallpaper in rooms that had been demolished decades ago, recall conversations with people who had been dead for half a century, and provide details about historical events that only someone who had lived through them could know. But the most disturbing aspect of her story was what happened after death. Eleanor described dying in 1952, feeling her body fail, and her consciousness begin to fade. But instead of ending, she found herself somewhere else, watching from what she called somewhere outside. She witnessed her own funeral, saw her children weeping over her grave, watched her husband grow old, and eventually remarry. She was there for all of it, unable to speak, unable to touch, unable to let them know she was still somehow present. Then in 1967, she woke up in a hospital in Columbus as a newborn baby, screaming with the full memories of 67 years still intact. She couldn't speak, couldn't communicate, couldn't explain to anyone what had happened. By the time she was old enough to articulate her experiences, decades had passed. Her children from her first life had grown old themselves, and then they had died, never knowing their mother was still alive, living a second life just a few hundred miles away. The cruelest moment came in 2003 when Eleanor, now middle-aged in her second body, attended the funeral of her granddaughter from her first life. She stood at the back of the church, surrounded by mourners who had no idea who she was, watching them bury a woman who had never known that her grandmother was standing right there, had been there all along, carrying memories of holding her as a baby. "She never knew I was there," Eleanor said through tears. "She never knew I had been there her whole life. Eleanor Marsh lives quietly in Ohio today, carrying the complete memories of two separate lives. She says she's afraid to die, not because of death itself, but because she doesn't know if she'll wake up again, somewhere else in time, forced to watch everyone she loves forget her all over again. Is consciousness itself the true time traveler? And how many others are out there, living lives they've already lived? The final case will change everything. Number 1. The man who sent himself a warning. This is the most mind-bending case on our entire list. A story so paradoxical that even theoretical physicists struggle to explain how it could be possible. A man receiving letters from his own future self, letters that predict his life with perfect accuracy, and a final warning that reveals the most terrifying truth about time travel imaginable, that saving yourself might be the very thing that destroys you. Imagine you are 31 years old, living alone in Seattle in 1978. You come home from work on an ordinary Tuesday evening, check your mailbox, and find an envelope with no return address. The postmark reads October 17th, 24, a date 46 years in the future. You almost throw it away as some kind of prank, but something makes you open it. And inside, you find a handwritten letter in penmanship you recognize immediately because it's your own. David Kowalski stood in his kitchen that night, reading a letter that should not have existed. The handwriting matched his perfectly, every loop and curve identical to his own script, but it was the content that made his hands tremble. The letter contained information about his future that no one could possibly know. The name of a woman called Margaret, who he would meet in 1983 and eventually marry. The birth dates of children he hadn't yet conceived. The city they would move to in 95. Details so specific, so intimate, that only he could have written them. The final section of the letter described his death, a car accident on a specific road at a specific intersection on a specific date in 2019. December 2019. The letter warned him in stark, desperate terms not to try to avoid it. Every attempt to change what happens creates more displacement, his own handwriting declared. You must let things unfold as they are meant to. Do not try to save yourself. David dismissed the letter as an elaborate hoax, but over the following years, every prediction came true. He met Margaret exactly when the letter said he would. His children were born on the exact dates. They moved to the exact city. Detail after detail, verification after verification, until David could no longer deny what he was holding. Somehow, impossibly, his future self had sent him a message across time. As 2019 approached, David became consumed by dread. He knew the date, knew the road, knew exactly how he was supposed to die, and despite the letter's warning, he couldn't accept it. On the morning of the predicted accident, he made a decision. He would not drive that road. He would stay home. He would change his fate, and it worked. The day passed without incident. David Kowalski survived. But that evening, as the sun set on the day he was supposed to die, David checked his mailbox and found another envelope. Same format, same postmark from 24, same handwriting, but the tone was completely different. This letter was angry, desperate, accusatory. You weren't supposed to survive. Now I can never get back. You've trapped us both. David read the words over and over, trying to understand what they meant. Slowly, horribly, the truth began to take shape. Somewhere in the future, a version of himself had discovered time travel. That version had traveled backward, perhaps trying to prevent his own death, perhaps trying to change something else entirely. But something had gone wrong. The act of sending warnings, of trying to alter the timeline, had created a fracture. And now that David had refused to die when he was supposed to, his future self was trapped, unable to return to any timeline, stuck somewhere between moments that no longer connected properly. By changing his fate, David had condemned another version of himself to eternal exile. David Kowalski is now 77 years old. He says he still receives letters sometimes, always in his own handwriting, always postmarked from dates that haven't arrived yet. Some contain warnings, some contain pleas, some contain accusations he doesn't fully understand. He stopped opening them years ago. He says he's afraid of what his future self might ask him to do. And he's even more afraid of what happens if he refuses. Is David Kowalski corresponding with himself across time? And if changing your own fate traps you outside of time forever, how many others are already lost in the spaces between seconds? The answers may be more terrifying than we can imagine. 10 people. 10 impossible journeys, 10 lives stranded in times that were never meant to be theirs. Some searched for decades, others gave up entirely, but all of them discovered the same devastating truth. Time travel may be possible, but return is not guaranteed. And now we must ask ourselves the most haunting question of all. How many travelers are still out there, lost in history, waiting for a way home that will never come?